Montana Territory, 1887. The winter wind howled across the snow-covered plains like a wounded animal, whipping ice crystals against the lone rider's face as he leaned into the storm. Ethan Aldridge pulled his coat collar higher, squinting through the white blur that had consumed the world around him. His 25-year-old body ached from hours in the saddle, muscles stiff from fighting both the biting cold and the spooked gelding beneath him. "Easy there, Merlin," he murmured, patting the horse's neck with a gloved hand. "Just need to make it to that line shack before this storm buries us both." The blizzard had descended without warning, transforming the afternoon sky into a churning mass of white fury in mere minutes. Ethan had been a fool to push so far from the Circle A ranch with bad weather threatening, but he'd needed to check the far northern fence line. Now he was paying the price for his stubborn determination. The line shack, a crude but solid structure his father had built years ago, stood somewhere ahead if he could just keep his bearings straight. The thought of his father sent a familiar pang through his chest. 3 years since the influenza had taken both his parents, leaving the ranch in Ethan's young hands. 3 years of solitude and responsibility that had aged him beyond his years. Ethan hunched lower against the wind. Out here in Montana Territory, a man learned quickly that attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford. The land took everything eventually: cattle, horses, loved ones. The frontier was no place for sentiment, only survival. His father's voice echoed in his memory: "A rancher stands alone against the elements, son. Depend on yourself and nothing else." He'd lived by those words, running the Circle A with grim efficiency, keeping neighboring ranchers and townspeople at arm's length. No wife to worry about, no children to fear for, just him against the elements, the way it had to be, the way it would always be. A strange sound carried through the howling wind, something that didn't belong to the storm's natural voice. Ethan reined Merlin to a halt, turning his head to catch it again. There, a cry, human, not animal. "Hello," he called, his voice swallowed immediately by the wind. The sound came again, fainter this time. To his right, maybe 50 yards through the blinding snow. Every instinct told him to continue toward shelter, but he couldn't ignore a call for help. Not in this weather, not even with night approaching. "Damn it all," he muttered, turning Merlin toward the sound. The horse resisted, sensing his rider's hesitation. As they moved closer, Ethan could make out a dark shape against the white landscape, the outline of an overturned wagon, half buried in a snowdrift. His heart quickened. Who would be fool enough to travel in this weather? "Hello," he called again, louder this time. "Anyone there?" A figure emerged from behind the wagon, wavering on its feet. A woman, he realized with shock, her cloak whipping around her slender form as she struggled toward him through knee-deep snow. She raised an arm, waving desperately. Ethan spurred Merlin forward, reaching her just as her legs gave out. He slid from the saddle, catching her before she crumpled to the ground. Miss, can you hear me?" he shouted over the wind, supporting her weight. Her face was alarmingly pale beneath her hood, lips tinged blue with cold. Her eyelids fluttered. "My horse," she whispered through chattering teeth. "Broke, leg, wagon overturned." "You're half frozen," Ethan said, scanning the area. "No sign of the horse. The line shack's not far." "I need to get you warm." Her eyes, a startling shade of green, focused on his face. "My things." "They'll have to wait," he said firmly, lifting her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, bundled in her heavy traveling clothes. "We'll come back when the storm breaks." He managed to get her onto Merlin's back, then swung up behind her, wrapping one arm securely around her waist while holding the reins with his other hand. She leaned back against his chest, her body trembling violently. "Stay with me," he urged, turning the horse toward where he believed the line shack stood. "What's your name?" "Tessa," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Tessa Keller." "I'm Ethan Aldridge. My ranch is about 10 miles south." "You picked a bad day for traveling, Miss Keller." She made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Didn't have a choice." The line shack appeared like an answered prayer, a dark rectangle against the white backdrop. Ethan had never been so relieved to see the humble structure. He dismounted quickly, helping Tessa down before leading Merlin to the lean-to at the side of the cabin. "Let me get you inside first," he told her, supporting her weight as she stumbled beside him. "Then I'll see to my horse." The cabin door was frozen shut. Ethan kicked it open, revealing the dark interior. One room, sparsely furnished with a narrow bed, table, 2 chairs, and a cast-iron stove. It wasn't much, but it would keep them alive. He deposited Tessa on the bed. "I need to tend to Merlin. There's blankets in that trunk. Wrap yourself up, but don't take off your wet things yet." Warming up too fast can be dangerous. She nodded weakly, her eyes already closing. Ethan worked quickly, unsaddling Merlin and rubbing him down before securing him in the linta with a feed bag. By the time he returned to the cabin with his saddlebags, snow caked on his boots and eyelashes, Tessa had managed to pull a rough wool blanket around her shoulders, but she hadn't moved from where he'd placed her. He barred the door against the storm, then knelt before the stove. His fingers, clumsy with cold, worked to light the kindling stored inside. The feeble flame caught, growing stronger as he fed it wood from the stack beside the stove. "You're lucky," he said, trying to fill the silence as warmth slowly began radiating through the cabin. "My foreman restocked this place last month. We've got food, water, and enough wood to last a few days." Tessa didn't respond. Ethan turned to find her slumped against the wall, unconscious. "Miss Keller," he crossed to her quickly, touching her face. Her skin felt like ice. "Tessa." She didn't stir. Frost clung to her eyelashes and the tendrils of chestnut hair escaping her hood. Hypothermia, he realized with a surge of alarm. He'd seen it before, cowboys caught in sudden blizzards, their bodies found only after the spring thaw. Working methodically, he removed her sodden cloak and outer garments, apologizing under his breath for the impropriety. Beneath her traveling clothes, she wore a simple blue dress, the fabric damp but not soaked through. Her skin was marble pale with delicate features that might have been beautiful if not for the blue tinge to her lips. Ethan hesitated, weighing propriety against survival. Survival won. He wrapped her in every blanket he could find, then stripped off his own wet coat and boots before sliding beneath the covers beside her, pulling her against his chest. Body heat was her best chance. "Don't you die on me," he muttered, rubbing her arms through the blankets. "Not after I risked my neck to find you." Outside, the storm raged on, rattling the cabin's single window. Inside, Ethan held this stranger close, feeling the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. He tried not to notice the faint floral scent of her hair or how perfectly she fit against him. This was necessity, nothing more. As night fell completely, Ethan fought against sleep, determined to keep watch. But the warmth of the stove and the exhaustion of the day gradually overcame him. His last conscious thought was that his father would call him 9 kinds of fool for risking himself for a stranger. Maybe he was right. Dawn arrived with eerie silence. The storm had passed, leaving the world transformed beneath a pristine blanket of snow. Ethan woke with a start, immediately aware of the warm body nestled against his side. Tessa Keller was curled toward him, one hand resting lightly on his chest, her breathing deep and regular. He extracted himself carefully, not wanting to wake her. In the pale morning light filtering through the frosted window, he could see her clearly for the first time. She was young, perhaps 22 or 23, with a heart-shaped face framed by dark chestnut hair that tumbled loose around her shoulders. Her complexion had lost its alarming pallor, replaced by a healthy flush. Ethan busied himself rebuilding the fire and taking stock of their supplies. The cabin was well provisioned: coffee, beans, flour, salt pork, and dried beef. They wouldn't go hungry while waiting for the trails to clear. A soft sound from the bed drew his attention. Tessa was awake, watching him with those remarkable green eyes, now alert and wary. "Morning," he said awkwardly, suddenly aware of his rumpled appearance. "How are you feeling?" She pulled the blankets closer around herself, looking disoriented. "Where am I?" "My line shack. About 10 miles north of my ranch." He poured water from a canteen into a tin cup. "You were half frozen when I found you yesterday." Recognition dawned in her eyes. "You rescued me from the storm." Her voice was low and melodious with a slight Eastern accent. "Mr. Aldridge, was it?" "Ethan," he corrected, bringing her the water. "And you're Tessa Keller." "That's about all I know." She accepted the cup with trembling hands. "Thank you for saving my life." He shrugged uncomfortably. "Couldn't leave you out there." He gestured toward the window. "Storm's passed, but there's near 3 feet of snow. We're stuck here until some of it melts or gets packed down." Alarm flashed across her face. "How long will that take?" "Few days, maybe a week, depends on the temperature." He studied her reaction. "You in some kind of hurry?" She lowered her gaze to the cup in her hands. "I need to reach Bozeman. I have business there." "Business?" Ethan repeated, not bothering to hide his skepticism. Women traveling alone in winter didn't typically have business in frontier towns. "Well, Bozeman's still going to be there when the snow clears. Right now, you should eat something." He turned back to the stove, giving her privacy to collect herself. From the corner of his eye, he saw her push back the blankets and smooth her rumpled dress, trying to restore some semblance of order to her appearance. "Is there water for washing?" she asked, her voice steadier. He nodded toward a basin on the small table. "Just melted snow, but it's clean. I'll step outside while you freshen up." The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow when he opened the door. The world had been transformed overnight. Mountains of snow drifted against trees and the side of the cabin. Merlin whickered a greeting from the lean-to, seeming no worse for the adventure. Ethan trudged through the snow to check on his horse, mind turning over the puzzle of Tessa Keller. A young, unaccompanied woman heading to Bozeman in the dead of winter was unusual enough to raise questions. Her clothes were of good quality, her speech educated, not a mail-order bride or a dance hall girl, he'd wager. Perhaps a schoolteacher summoned for a position, but why the urgency to reach town? None of his business, he reminded himself firmly. He'd get her safely to Bozeman when weather permitted, then return to his solitary life at the Circle A end of story. When he returned to the cabin, Tessa had transformed herself as best she could. Her face was freshly washed, her hair neatly braided over one shoulder. She'd straightened the bed and was attempting to sweep the floor with a crude broom. "You don't need to do that," he said, stamping snow from his boots. She looked up, a slight flush on her cheeks. "I wanted to be useful. You've done enough for me already." Ethan hung his coat on a peg by the door. "How about some breakfast instead?" "I make a decent pan of flapjacks." For the first time, a hint of a smile touched her lips. "That sounds wonderful. I haven't eaten since yesterday morning." They worked together in the small space, Ethan mixing batter while Tessa sliced salt pork. The domesticity of it felt strange to him. He'd grown accustomed to eating alone at the ranch house, often standing over the stove rather than bothering with a proper table setting. "Have you lived in Montana Territory long?" Tessa asked as they sat down to eat. Ethan nodded. "My father brought us here when I was 12, claimed land south of here, built up a decent cattle operation. Circle A Ranch," he cut into his flapjacks, "been running it myself these past 3 years." "Your parents?" "Gone. Influenza took them both the same week." He said it matter-of-factly, the way he always did, pushing down the hollow feeling that accompanied the words. "I'm sorry," she said softly, and something in her tone made him look up. Her expression held genuine sympathy, not just polite condolence. He shrugged. "Life out here is harsh. You learn to accept it or you break." "And you've chosen not to break," she observed. Her insight made him uncomfortable. "What about you? Where are you from?" A shadow crossed her face. "Boston originally. Though I've been in Helena for the past year." "Long way from home," Ethan noted. "Family back east." "None living." Her tone discouraged further questions on that line. They finished eating in silence. Afterward, Tessa insisted on washing the dishes while Ethan checked their supplies again, mentally calculating how long they could stay at the line shack if necessary. "We should try to recover your things," he said eventually. "If we can find your wagon, we might salvage some of your belongings." Relief brightened her face. "Could we? I have important papers and keepsakes." "If the snow's not too deep, we can try this afternoon. I've got snowshoes in the lean-to." Tessa's smile transformed her face, revealing a natural beauty that caught Ethan off guard. "Thank you, truly." He looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "It's nothing." But as they prepared to venture out into the snow-covered landscape, Ethan found himself unusually aware of her presence. The graceful way she moved in the small cabin, the scent of her hair when she passed close to him, the melodious quality of her voice. It had been a long time since he'd spent more than passing moments in a woman's company, and never in such confined quarters. "Get a hold of yourself," he thought sternly. "She's just a woman who needs help getting to town, nothing more." The trek to Tessa's wagon proved challenging but not impossible. The snow had drifted in some places to waist height, but Ethan's snowshoes allowed him to break trail, while Tessa followed in his footsteps. She wore his spare coat, which engulfed her slender frame, making her look even more vulnerable against the vast white landscape. They found the wagon where he'd left it, now almost completely buried in snow. The horse was gone. Either it had freed itself and wandered off, or predators had found it in the night. Ethan didn't voice this last possibility. "Wait here," he told Tessa, testing the stability of the snow-covered wagon. "Let me dig it out first." She nodded, hugging herself against the cold while he worked. It took nearly an hour of shoveling with a board from the wagon bed before he could reach the storage compartment at the back. "What am I looking for?" he called. "There's a leather satchel," she replied, "and a carpet bag with my clothes. The satchel is most important." Ethan located both items, along with a wooden box that looked like it might hold valuables. "This too?" he asked, holding it up. Tessa nodded quickly. "Yes, please, that contains family heirlooms." He raised an eyebrow but didn't comment. Strange items for a woman supposedly traveling on business, but frontier life had taught him that people's stories were their own to tell, or keep. The journey back to the line shack was slower, burdened as they were with Tessa's belongings. By the time they reached the cabin, the short winter day was fading, and both were exhausted. "Thank you," Tessa said fervently once they were inside, clutching the leather satchel to her chest. "You cannot know what this means to me." "Must be important papers," Ethan remarked, stoking the fire. She hesitated. "They are. Documents I need for my future." Before he could question further, she turned away, opening her carpet bag to sort through its contents. The conversation was clearly closed. The next 3 days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Mornings began with Ethan tending to Merlin while Tessa prepared a simple breakfast. They spent the days maintaining the cabin, melting snow for water, and taking turns reading aloud from a dog-eared copy of The Last of the Mohicans that Ethan found in the trunk. Evenings were passed with conversation that gradually became less stilted as they grew more comfortable with each other. Ethan learned that Tessa was 23 years old, had been educated at a ladies' seminary in Boston, and possessed a quick mind and dry wit that surprised him. She was particularly knowledgeable about literature and could recite poetry from memory, a talent that both impressed and bemused him. He found himself telling her about the Circle A, the struggles and triumphs of ranching in Montana Territory, his plans to expand the herd in the spring, even stories about his parents that he hadn't shared with anyone since their passing. "Your mother sounds like a remarkable woman," Tessa said on the third evening as they sat before the fire, "to leave a comfortable life in St. Louis for the untamed frontier." Ethan nodded, whittling a piece of wood with his pocket knife. "She never complained, even during that first winter when we nearly froze in a tent waiting for Pa to finish the cabin. Said she married the man, not his circumstances." "A wise perspective," Tessa mused, her fingers busy darning a tear in one of her stockings. "Were they happy, your parents?" The question made Ethan pause. "I believe they were. They argued plenty, Ma had opinions about everything, and Pa was stubborn as a mule, but there was never any doubt they belonged together." He shook his head, smiling at the memory. "Pa used to say she saved him from himself." "How so?" "He was wild in his younger days, rode with rough crowds, took foolish risks. Meeting Ma changed him, gave him purpose." Ethan resumed his whittling, uncomfortable with the turn in conversation. "What about your family?" A shadow crossed Tessa's face. "My mother died when I was 16, my father remarried a year later." "You didn't get along with your stepmother," Ethan guessed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "She had different plans for me than I had for myself." Before he could inquire further, she stood abruptly. "The snow seems to be melting. Do you think we might reach town soon?" Ethan recognized a deliberate change of subject when he heard one. "Another day or two, weather permitting. The trail down to the main road should be passable by then." Relief flashed across her face, followed by something that looked almost like disappointment. "Good, that's good." That night, as they prepared for sleep, Ethan on a makeshift pallet near the stove, Tessa on the narrow bed, he found himself watching her in the firelight as she brushed out her long chestnut hair. There was a grace to her movements, a quiet dignity despite their circumstances that stirred something in him he'd thought long buried. She caught him looking and paused, brush mid-stroke. "Is something wrong?" "No," he said quickly, turning away. "Just thinking it'll be good to get back to the ranch." It wasn't entirely a lie. He missed his home, his routine. Yet the thought of returning to his solitary existence no longer held the same appeal it had just days ago. "Fool," he chided himself as he settled onto his pallet, getting soft over a pretty face and some pleasant conversation. "She's bound for Bozeman and whatever business awaits her there. And you're better off alone, just like Pa always said." But as he drifted toward sleep, his father's voice seemed less certain than before. The morning of their 5th day dawned clear and considerably warmer. Ethan stepped outside to find the snow noticeably reduced, with patches of ground showing through in places where the sun hit directly. "We can leave today," he announced when he returned to the cabin. "Trail should be manageable now. We'll stop at my ranch to rest the horse, then I can take you on to Bozeman tomorrow." Tessa looked up from packing her carpet bag, her expression unreadable. You've already done so much. I couldn't impose further. It's no imposition, Ethan insisted. Bozeman's a rough town for a woman alone. I'd feel better seeing you safely there. A flash of something resignation crossed her face. Very well. If you're certain. They departed mid-morning, Tessa seated securely in front of Ethan on Merlin, her few belongings tied behind the saddle. The journey was slow, the horse picking his way carefully through the melting snow. By unspoken agreement, they kept conversation light, as if the intimacy that had developed in the line shack belonged only to that place and time. It was late afternoon when the Circle A ranch came into view, a sprawling main house with several outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn, all situated in a protected valley with mountains rising majestically behind it. It's beautiful, Tessa said softly. You've built something wonderful here. Pride swelled in Ethan's chest. My father chose the location, said the mountains would protect us from the worst of the winter winds. He nudged Merlin into a faster walk. Come on, I'm sure Thomas has been worried sick. As if on cue, a stocky figure emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the setting sun. Thomas Riley, Ethan's foreman for the past 7 years, broke into a wide grin when he recognized the rider. Boss, he called, hurrying forward to meet them. We were about to send out a search party. Got caught in that blizzard, did you? Ethan dismounted, helping Tessa down after him. Made it to the North Line shack just in time. Thomas, this is Miss Tessa Keller. Her wagon overturned in the storm. Thomas tipped his hat respectfully, though Ethan didn't miss the curious glance he shot between them. Pleasure, ma'am. Glad the boss found you before you froze solid. So am I, Mr. Riley, Tessa replied with a warm smile. Your employer is quite the hero. Ethan felt heat rise to his face. Hardly that. Just doing what anyone would. He handed Merlin's reins to Thomas. Give him extra oats tonight, he's earned it. As Thomas led the horse away, Ethan guided Tessa toward the main house. It's not fancy, but there's a proper guest room with a real bed. Must be a welcome sight after days in that shack. The house was warm and smelled of fresh bread, evidence that Mrs. Hoffman, the housekeeper who came in 3 times a week, had been expecting Ethan's return. He showed Tessa to the guest room, a simple but comfortable space with a full-sized bed, washstand, and small desk. Bathrooms down the hall, he explained. We've got hot water from the kitchen boiler if you want a proper bath. Her eyes lit up. A real bath sounds like heaven. He smiled at her enthusiasm. I'll have Mrs. Hoffman prepare one for you, dinner in an hour. Left alone, Ethan made his way to his own room, suddenly aware of how unkempt he must look and smell after days in the line shack. He washed thoroughly, shaved his stubbled jaw, and changed into clean clothes before heading to the kitchen to check on dinner preparations. Mrs. Hoffman, a robust widow in her 50s, was stirring a pot of stew on the stove. She turned when Ethan entered, hands on her hips. So you've brought home a lady friend, she said without preamble. Thomas says she's a beauty. Ethan sighed. Nothing stayed private for long on a ranch. She's not a lady friend. Her wagon overturned in the storm. I'm taking her to Bozeman tomorrow. Mrs. Hoffman made a non-committal sound. Well, the bath is ready in the washroom. I've laid out some of my daughter's things, might be a bit large but they're clean. And there's fresh stew, biscuits, and apple pie for dinner. You're a godsend, Mrs. Hoffman, Ethan said gratefully. The older woman softened. It's good to have you back safe. That storm was a bad one. When Tessa appeared for dinner, Ethan nearly dropped the plates he was setting on the dining room table. Her hair, freshly washed and dried, fell in soft waves past her shoulders, and though Mrs. Hoffman's borrowed dress hung loosely on her slender frame, she looked transformed by the simple comforts of a bath and clean clothes. I hope I haven't kept you waiting, she said, self-consciously touching her hair. Ethan cleared his throat. Not at all, please sit down. Mrs. Hoffman had outdone herself with the meal, clearly attempting to impress their guest. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, the biscuits light and fluffy, and the apple pie still warm from the oven. This is wonderful, Tessa said after her first few bites. I haven't had home cooking like this since. She trailed off, her expression clouding. Ethan waited, but she didn't continue. Mrs. Hoffman's the best cook in the county, he said, filling the silence. Comes in Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to keep me from living on coffee and jerky. Tessa smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. You're fortunate to have her. After dinner, they moved to the small parlor where a fire blazed in the hearth. The room was simply furnished but comfortable, with a worn leather sofa, two armchairs, and bookshelves lining one wall. "Your home is lovely," Tessa said, running her fingers along the spines of the books. "So many volumes. Did you collect these?" Ethan settled into one of the armchairs. "Most were my mother's. She insisted on bringing her entire library when we moved west. Said civilization meant having Shakespeare on hand." Tessa laughed, a genuine sound that warmed him more than the fire. "A woman after my own heart. I brought precious few books with me from Boston, and I've missed them terribly." "Help yourself to any that interest you," Ethan offered, "for the journey tomorrow." Her smile faltered. "That's very kind." An awkward silence fell between them. The easy companionship of the lined shack seemed to have evaporated in the more formal setting of the ranch house. Ethan felt suddenly unsure of himself, acutely aware of how long it had been since he'd entertained a woman in his home. "If you're tired from the journey, don't feel you need to stay up on my account," he said finally. Tessa nodded, seeming relieved. "I am rather weary if you don't mind." "Of course not," he stood as she did. "Breakfast at 7. "Perfect." She hesitated at the parlor door. "Ethan, thank you for everything." Before he could respond, she was gone, her footsteps fading down the hallway. Ethan remained by the fire long after she'd retired, staring into the flames. Tomorrow he would take her to Bozeman, and that would be the end of it. Back to his solitary existence, his carefully ordered life. It was for the best. So why did the thought leave him feeling so hollow? Morning arrived with a knock on his bedroom door. Ethan opened it to find Mrs. Hoffman, her expression grim. "That young lady of yours is gone," she announced without preamble. Ethan stared at her. "What do you mean, gone?" "Left before dawn. Thomas says she asked him to saddle a horse for her, said you'd approved it." Mrs. Hoffman crossed her arms. He thought it odd, but she was quite insistent. "Said she had urgent business in Bozeman and couldn't wait." Disbelief gave way to anger as Ethan brushed past the housekeeper, striding toward the guest room. The door stood open, the bed neatly made. Tessa's carpetbag and the wooden box were missing, but to his surprise, the leather satchel lay on the desk, prominently displayed. Beside it was a folded piece of paper with his name written in an elegant hand. Ethan unfolded the note, his anger faltering as he read, "Dear Ethan, forgive my abrupt departure. There are circumstances I cannot explain that require me to continue alone. Please know that my gratitude for your rescue and kindness is boundless. You are a good man, perhaps too good for the deception I have practiced. The contents of this satchel will explain much, though I fear they will also lower your opinion of me. I leave them in your keeping, no longer willing to carry the burden they represent. If our paths should cross again, I hope you might find it in your heart to understand, if not forgive. With deepest thanks and regret, Tessa." Ethan stared at the letter, reading it twice before setting it aside and opening the satchel with unsteady hands. Inside were several documents. A marriage certificate, legal papers bearing official seals, and newspaper clippings. The marriage certificate bore Tessa's name alongside one he didn't recognize, Charles Blackmore, dated June 15, 1885, in Helena, Montana Territory. The legal papers were more complex: property deeds, mining claims, and what appeared to be a will, all in Blackmore's name. The newspaper clippings told a darker story. Prominent Helena businessman found dead in home. Mysterious circumstances surround Blackmore death. Widow questioned in husband's passing. The most recent clipping, dated just 2 weeks earlier, made Ethan's blood run cold. Blackmore widow sought for questioning. Authorities suspect foul play in businessman's death. "My God," he breathed, sinking onto the bed. Tessa Keller, or rather Tessa Blackmore, was wanted for her husband's murder. The woman he'd rescued, shared meals with, talked with by firelight, was running from the law, and now she was riding toward Bozeman on one of his horses, perhaps to flee the territory entirely. Thomas appeared in the doorway, his expression troubled. "Boss, Mrs. Hoffman said Miss Keller left, everything all right." Ethan's first impulse was to gather his men, pursue Tessa, and bring her back to face justice. It was what any law-abiding rancher would do. Instead, he carefully returned the documents to the satchel. "Which horse did she take?" "The bay mare," Thomas replied, "said you told her she could have her." Ethan nodded slowly. "I did. Miss Keller had business in Bozeman that couldn't wait." Thomas looked skeptical but knew better than to press. "If you say so, boss, anything else you need?" "No," Ethan stood, tucking the satchel under his arm. Just get back to regular duties. Storm put us behind. After Thomas left, Ethan returned to his room and locked the satchel in the bottom drawer of his desk. He needed time to think to make sense of this revelation. Was Tessa truly capable of murder? The woman he'd come to know in those days at the Line Shack had seemed gentle, intelligent, refined, not a cold-blooded killer. But he barely knew her. 5 days in a cabin during a snowstorm hardly qualified him to judge her character or innocence. Still, doubt nagged at him. Something about the newspaper accounts rang false or at least incomplete. Why would a wealthy businessman's wife need to flee if she were guilty? Wouldn't her position and money afford her the best legal defense? Against his better judgment, Ethan made a decision. He would ride to Bozeman not to apprehend Tessa but to learn more. If she were truly guilty, the law would take its course. But if there were more to the story, he saddled Merlin himself, telling Mrs. Hoffman he had business in town. The journey to Bozeman normally took the better part of a day, but with the trails still partially snow-covered, it might take longer. Tessa had several hours head start, but the bay mare wasn't particularly fast. As Ethan rode, his mind churned with questions. What had Tessa's marriage been like? Why had she been traveling alone in such weather? Was she fleeing the law or someone else? He reached the outskirts of Bozeman as dusk was falling, the town's lights twinkling in the valley below. Despite its frontier location, Bozeman was growing rapidly, with several hotels, saloons, shops, and even a small theater lining its main street. Ethan headed for the livery stable first. If Tessa had arrived, she would have needed to stable the bay mare. The stable master, a grizzled man named Peterson, nodded in recognition when Ethan described the horse and rider. Came in about 3 hours ago, he confirmed. Pretty little thing said she was heading for the Western Hotel. Ethan thanked him and left Merlin in his care before walking the short distance to the hotel. The Western was one of Bozeman's better establishments, catering to business travelers and the occasional wealthy tourist on their way to the newly established Yellowstone National Park. The desk clerk was less forthcoming than the stable master. "We don't give out information about our guests, sir," he said primly when Ethan inquired about Tessa. Ethan leaned closer. "Listen, I'm not looking to cause trouble. The lady's my friend. She left some important papers at my ranch, and I need to return them." The clerk remained unmoved. "I suggest you leave them with me, and I'll see that any guest they belong to receives them." Frustrated, Ethan turned away and froze. Through the lobby window, he spotted Tessa crossing the street, heading toward the hotel. She was dressed in the same clothes she'd borrowed from Mrs. Hoffman, her hair partially concealed by a borrowed shawl. Ethan stepped outside just as she reached the hotel steps. Her eyes widened in shock when she saw him. "Ethan," she gasped, glancing around as if contemplating flight. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Not here." She hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "There's a small restaurant behind the hotel, less crowded." They walked in tense silence to the establishment, a modest eatery with checked tablecloths and privacy afforded by high-backed booths. A tired-looking waitress showed them to a corner table, took their order for coffee, and left them alone. "How did you find me?" Tessa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Wasn't difficult." "There aren't many places to stay in Bozeman." Ethan studied her face, searching for signs of the murderer depicted in the newspaper articles. He found only fatigue and fear in her eyes. "Were you going to tell me the truth?" "Ever?" She looked down at her hands. "I thought it better you didn't know." "That you're wanted for your husband's murder." The words came out harsher than he'd intended. Tessa flinched. "I didn't kill Charles. The newspapers suggest otherwise." "Newspapers print what sells copies," she said bitterly. "And a story about a young wife poisoning her wealthy older husband sells very well indeed." The waitress returned with their coffee, interrupting momentarily. When she'd gone, Ethan leaned forward. "Then tell me the truth, all of it." Tessa took a deep breath, wrapping her fingers around the coffee cup as if seeking its warmth. "I married Charles Blackmore 2 years ago. He was 45 to my 21, a successful businessman in Helena with mining interests throughout the territory. My father had just died, leaving substantial debts. Charles offered security, respectability. Not love, Ethan couldn't help asking. A sad smile touched her lips. That wasn't part of the arrangement. Charles was kind in his way. He provided well for me, allowed me freedom to pursue my interests. In return, I was the perfect hostess, the ornament on his arm at social functions." She paused, her expression darkening. What the newspapers don't mention is that Charles had enemies, powerful men who resented his success, particularly in the mining business. He received threats in the weeks before his death. What happened to him? Arsenic poisoning, according to the doctor. I was away visiting a friend when it happened. When I returned, he was already dead. Her voice broke slightly. The authorities immediately suspected me, a young wife, a wealthy older husband. It's an old story. But you ran, Ethan pointed out, makes you look guilty. Tessa's eyes flashed. I ran because someone planted arsenic in my personal belongings. The sheriff found it during a search of our home. I was to be arrested the next morning. The waitress approached again, asking if they wanted food. Ethan ordered for both of them, hardly aware of what he requested. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of Tessa's story. The documents in the satchel, he said when they were alone again. The will, the mining claims. Charles left everything to me, Tessa explained. The house in Helena, his business interests, everything. Nearly $500,000 in assets, she laughed bitterly. The perfect motive for murder, according to the prosecutor. And now I'm trying to reach Canada. I have a distant cousin in Vancouver who might take me in. She met his gaze directly. I left the satchel with you because those documents are worthless to me now. Perhaps they'll prove valuable to the authorities in building their case, but I couldn't bear to destroy them. They were Charles's life's work. Ethan sat back, processing her words. Her story sounded plausible, but he'd learned long ago that truth on the frontier was rarely simple. Why Bozeman? He asked. It's not exactly on the direct route to Canada. Something flickered in her eyes, hesitation. I have a friend here who might help me obtain transportation north. The stagecoach to Helena would be watched. Before Ethan could press further, the door to the restaurant opened, admitting a gust of cold air and a man whose appearance immediately commanded attention. Tall and expensively dressed, with silver threading his dark hair at the temples, he carried himself with the confidence of wealth and power. Tessa went rigid, her face draining of color. We need to leave, she whispered urgently. Now. Why? Who is that? Ethan asked, though something in her reaction had already put him on alert. Victor Harmon, she hissed. Charles's business partner, the man I believe killed my husband. The newcomer was speaking to the hostess, his back to their table. Ethan calculated the distance to the rear exit. Can you slip out while I distract him? He asked in a low voice. Tessa nodded, already gathering her shawl. Ethan stood abruptly, deliberately knocking over his coffee cup. The clatter drew attention from throughout the small restaurant, including Harmon. While heads turned toward the commotion, Tessa slipped from the booth and hurried toward the back door. Clumsy of me, Ethan said loudly, making a show of mopping up the spill with his napkin. He was about to follow Tessa when Harmon's voice cut through the restaurant. Mrs. Blackmore, is that you? Tessa froze, one hand on the door. For a heartbeat, Ethan thought she might still escape, but then she straightened her shoulders and turned. Mr. Harmon, she acknowledged, her voice remarkably steady. What a surprise. Harmon's handsome face broke into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Indeed, I'd heard you'd left Helena rather hastily. He glanced at Ethan, then back to Tessa. I see you've found company for your journey. Just sharing a meal with a fellow traveler, Tessa replied coolly. Ethan moved to her side, instinctively placing himself between her and Harmon. Ethan Aldridge, he introduced himself, not offering his hand. Victor Harmon, the older man, inclined his head slightly. I'm an old friend of Mrs. Blackmore's late husband. How fortunate we should meet, Tessa said, her composure admirable despite the tension Ethan could feel radiating from her. If you'll excuse us, Mr. Aldridge and I were just leaving. Actually, my dear, I think we should talk. Harmon's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. The authorities in Helena are most anxious to speak with you. As Charles's partner and executor of his estate in your absence, I feel somewhat responsible. Ethan's hand drifted toward the revolver concealed beneath his coat. Miss Keller has no obligation to speak with you, Mr. Harmon. Harmon's eyebrows rose. Miss Keller, I see. His smile turned predatory. You're not aware of who your dining companion truly is, are you, Mr. Aldridge? Allow me to enlighten you. That won't be necessary, Ethan cut him off. I know exactly who she is. Surprise flickered across Harmon's face, quickly masked. Then you're harboring a fugitive. Not wise in this territory, rancher. The restaurant had gone quiet, the few other patrons watching the confrontation with undisguised interest. The waitress had disappeared, presumably to fetch help. "We're leaving," Ethan said firmly, placing a hand at the small of Tessa's back to guide her toward the door. "Good evening, Mr. Harmon." They were almost to the exit when Harmon called after them. "She'll hang, you know." "The evidence is quite compelling." Tessa stumbled slightly, but Ethan kept her moving, out the door and into the cold night air. "He'll go for the sheriff," she said as they hurried down the alley behind the restaurant. "We don't have much time." "Then we'd better get out of town," Ethan replied grimly, steering her toward the livery stable. "Can you ride through the night?" She nodded, her face resolute despite the fear in her eyes. "I've managed worse these past weeks." At the stable, Ethan quickly saddled Merlin and the bay mare, paying Peterson extra to forget he'd seen them. The stable master, sensing trouble but respecting the universal frontier code of minding one's own business, simply pocketed the money with a nod. They rode out of Bozeman by a back route, avoiding Main Street where the sheriff's office was located. The moon provided enough light to navigate the trail leading north out of town, but they would need to find shelter before long. "There's a trapper's cabin about 10 miles ahead," Ethan said as they pushed their horses to a steady trot. "We can rest there, figure out our next move." Tessa didn't respond immediately, her focus on the trail ahead. Finally she asked, "Why are you helping me? You could be charged as an accomplice." It was a fair question, one Ethan had been asking himself since he'd decided to follow her to Bozeman. By all rights, he should have turned those documents over to the authorities, washed his hands of the matter entirely. "I don't believe you killed your husband," he said simply. "You barely know me." "I know enough," he glanced at her, silhouetted against the moonlit landscape. "No one who recites Wordsworth by a cabin fire is capable of cold-blooded murder." A surprised laugh escaped her. "That's hardly sound legal reasoning." "Maybe not, but my gut says you're telling the truth about Harmon," he urged Merlin over a small stream. "Besides, I've never much trusted men who wear diamond stickpins." They rode in silence after that, pushing the horses as much as they dared on the partially cleared trail. The night grew colder, their breath clouding in the moonlight. Finally, the small cabin came into view, a crude but solid structure built by a trapper Ethan had once employed at the Circle A. "It's not much," he said as they dismounted, "but it's off the main trail, should buy us some time." The cabin was cold and musty, but the stone fireplace was intact, and a stack of firewood remained from the previous occupant. Ethan lit a fire while Tessa tended to the horses in the lean-to. "We can rest here until dawn," he said when she returned, stomping snow from her boots. "Then we'll need to decide where to go." Tessa sank onto a rough-hewn bench near the fire, exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. "I've put you in a terrible position. I never meant for anyone else to be involved in this." Ethan busied himself laying out the meager provisions he'd packed, jerky, hardtack, and a flask of whiskey. "Bit late for regrets now. Harmon saw us together. If you're a fugitive, I'm your accomplice." "You could go back," she suggested half-heartedly. "Tell them I forced you to help me, that you only just learned who I was. And leave you to face Harmon and the law alone." He shook his head. "Not an option." She studied his face in the flickering firelight. "Why, you've built a life, a successful ranch. Why risk everything for a woman you barely know?" It was the question Ethan had been avoiding since finding the documents in the satchel. Why was he throwing away everything he'd worked for, the ranch that had been his father's dream, his own life's work? "Because some things matter more," he said finally, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "Truth. Justice." He met her gaze, "not leaving someone to face wolves alone." Tears welled in her eyes, even if that someone brought the wolves down on herself. "You didn't ask for any of this," Ethan countered. "You married a man who offered security when you needed it. You didn't kill him. And now his killer is hunting you to cover his own crime." He passed her the flask of whiskey. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we figure out how to prove Harmon murdered your husband." Tessa took a small sip, grimacing at the burn. "Even if we could, how? We can't go to the authorities. They're convinced of my guilt. We can't return to Helena where the evidence might be found. And Harmon is wealthy, connected, powerful." "So we're at a disadvantage," Ethan acknowledged. "Wouldn't be the first time. The frontier tends to level things." Despite the gravity of their situation, Tessa smiled. "You're a strange man, Ethan Aldridge. Most people run from trouble." "Never been accused of being most people," he replied, returning her smile. Now get some sleep, I'll take first watch. They divided the night into shifts, neither fully trusting that Harmon hadn't somehow tracked their departure from Bozeman. Ethan insisted Tessa take the cabin's only cot while he sat by the fire, revolver close at hand. In the stillness of the night, watching the fire's embers fade, he confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. His feelings for Tessa had progressed far beyond mere concern for a wrongfully accused woman. Somewhere between rescuing her from the blizzard and their confrontation with Harmon, she had slipped past the carefully constructed barriers around his heart. It was foolish, reckless even. She was a widow suspected of murder, a woman with a past he knew little about, running for her life. And yet, watching her sleep in the dim light, her face finally peaceful in repose, Ethan knew with absolute certainty that he would risk everything to keep her safe. His father would call him 10 kinds of fool, maybe he was right. But for the first time since his parents' death, Ethan felt fully alive. Dawn arrived with a cold clarity that matched Ethan's resolve. While Tessa still slept, he stepped outside to check their surroundings. The forest surrounding the cabin was silent save for the occasional call of a winter bird, no sign of pursuit. When he returned, Tessa was awake, attempting to tame her hair into a braid. No sign of company, he reported. But we should move soon. She nodded, finishing her braid with deft fingers. Where will we go? I've been thinking about that. Ethan poured the last of their water into a pot for coffee. Harmon believes you're running north to Canada. He'll send men in that direction. So we go south instead. Better, Ethan met her gaze. We go straight at him. Tessa stared at him. What do you mean? Back to Helena. To find proof he killed your husband. That's madness, she protested. The entire city is looking for me. I'd be arrested the moment someone recognized me. Not if no one recognizes you. Ethan studied her thoughtfully. Your hair is your most distinctive feature. Cut it, change your clothes to something plain and practical, and you'd look like any frontier woman. Tessa's hand went protectively to her braid. Cut my hair. Just a suggestion, he shrugged. But we need evidence against Harmon, and Helena is where we'll find it. She was quiet for a moment, absently touching her hair. Then with sudden determination she said, Do you have a knife? Ethan blinked. You're serious. You're right. Helena is our only option. She held out her hand. Knife, please. He withdrew his hunting knife from its sheath, hesitating before placing it in her palm. Are you sure? Once it's done. It's just hair, she said firmly, though her fingers trembled slightly as she took the knife. It will grow back. Ethan turned away as she set to work, giving her privacy for this intimate act. The soft sounds of sawing filled the cabin, followed by the whisper of hair falling to the floor. When he turned back, the transformation was startling. Tessa's luxurious chestnut locks now fell just below her ears in a rough, uneven cut that completely altered her appearance. Without the softening effect of long hair, her cheekbones stood out more prominently, her jawline more defined. Well, she asked, a hint of vulnerability in her voice. It suits you, he said honestly, makes you look less like a society woman, more like a frontier wife. He nodded, difference. But still beautiful. A faint blush colored her cheeks. What's the rest of this plan? We can't simply walk into Helena asking questions about Charles's death. No, Ethan agreed, forcing his mind back to the problem at hand. But I have friends there, people who won't recognize you and won't ask too many questions. As they prepared to leave, Tessa gathered her shorn hair, twisting it into a coil. Seems a shame to leave it, she explained when she caught Ethan watching. Silly sentiment, I suppose. Not silly, he assured her, just human. The journey to Helena would take several days, requiring them to avoid main roads and towns where Harmon might have sent word. They traveled at an easy pace, conserving the horses' strength and stopping only when necessary. At night, they camped beneath the stars or sought shelter in abandoned line shacks and hunting cabins. The forced intimacy of their situation created a strange domesticity between them, cooking simple meals over campfires, sharing stories to pass the time, working together to survive. Ethan found himself telling Tessa things he'd never shared with anyone. His fears when his father first fell ill, the overwhelming responsibility of taking over the ranch at 22, the loneliness of the years since. Didn't you ever consider marrying? She asked one night as they sat beside a small fire the horses hobbled nearby, finding someone to share the burden. Ethan poked at the embers with a stick. Once. There was a girl in Bozeman, daughter of a merchant, pretty kind. Father approved. What happened? She couldn't face frontier life, the isolation, the hardship, he shrugged. Can't blame her, it's a harsh existence for a woman. Tessa studied him across the fire, yet you never left. Never considered selling the ranch, returning to civilization. The ranch is my legacy, Ethan said simply. My father's dream, my responsibility. Even at the cost of your own happiness. The question struck closer to home than he cared to admit. Who says I'm not happy? Are you? She challenged gently. Ethan was saved from answering by a distant howl of wolves on the hunt. They both listened, automatically drawing closer to the fire. We should take turns watching tonight, he said, changing the subject. I'll go first. Tessa accepted the evasion without comment, wrapping herself in a blanket and settling near the fire. Soon her breathing deepened into sleep. Ethan watched her in the firelight, her new shorter hair framing her face softly. How strange that this woman who had crashed into his carefully ordered existence now seemed to belong there, as if she'd always been part of his world. The thought terrified him. They reached the outskirts of Helena on the 5th day of their journey. The territorial capital was larger and more developed than Bozeman, with substantial brick buildings lining its main streets and elegant homes belonging to mining magnates and territorial officials dotting the surrounding hills. Charles's house is in the north part of town, Tessa said as they paused on a ridge overlooking the city, the area they call Mansion District. We'll avoid it for now, Ethan decided. My friend Jacob owns a livery at the south end. He'll give us shelter while we figure out our next move. Jacob Miller was indeed happy to see his old friend, though clearly curious about the quiet Mrs. Aldridge, Ethan introduced as his wife. The fiction came easily to his lips, and Tessa played along without hesitation, demurely keeping her gaze lowered when introduced. Heading to visit family in Virginia City, Ethan explained their presence. Thought we'd rest a day or two in Helena first. Jacob offered them a small room above the livery stable, basic but clean, and asked no questions when Ethan requested he not mention their presence to anyone. Owe you my life twice over, Jacob said simply, referring to an incident years earlier when Ethan had pulled him from a burning barn. Your business is yours. Once alone in their sparse accommodation, Tessa sank onto the narrow bed, the strain of maintaining her composure evident. I never thought I'd return to Helena, she admitted quietly. Not like this. Ethan remained by the window, watching the busy street below. We need information about Harmon, about your husband's business dealings. Anything that might point to motive. Charles kept his papers in his study, Tessa said, but the house will be watched, possibly even occupied by Harmon now that he's executor of the estate. There must be other sources. Business partners, associates, servants who might have seen something. Tessa thought for a moment. There was Charles's secretary, Mr. Reynolds. He knew everything about the business, and our housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, she's been with the family for years. How do we find them without exposing ourselves? Reynolds lives in a boarding house on Pine Street. Mrs. Fletcher has a sister who runs a laundry near the railway station. Tessa twisted her hands in her lap. But I can't simply walk up to them. They know me, even with my hair cut. Ethan considered the problem. I'll go, as a businessman interested in investing in mining interests. I can ask about Blackmore Enterprises, mention I'd heard of the founder's tragic death. Reynolds might speak to you, Tessa agreed cautiously. He's always eager to discuss the business. But be careful, he's loyal to the company, which now essentially means Harmon. And the housekeeper. A small smile touched Tessa's lips. Bring laundry. Mrs. Fletcher's sister charges a premium, but she's the best in Helena. And she gossips incessantly. They spent the evening refining their plan, Tessa providing Ethan with enough details about the mining business and her husband's operations to make his inquiries seem legitimate. Charles's primary holding was the Silverleaf mine, she explained. It's been extraordinarily profitable this past year, which is why Harmon was so eager to secure complete control after Charles's death. How did Harmon become involved with your husband's business? Tessa's expression darkened. They were childhood friends, apparently. When Charles needed additional capital to expand the Silverleaf operations 2 years ago, he approached Harmon. The partnership seemed successful, but in recent months there was tension between them. What kind of tension? I'm not entirely sure. Charles became secretive, spending long hours in his study with the account books. Once I overheard an argument, something about discrepancies in the ore shipments. Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Could be important. Anything else? Just Tessa hesitated. A few weeks before his death, Charles changed his will. He never discussed it with me, but he seemed worried. Her voice dropped. He started keeping a revolver in his desk drawer. He'd never owned a gun before. The next morning, Ethan set out alone, dressed in his best clothes with a borrowed watch chain to complete the image of a prosperous businessman. His first stop was the boarding house on Pine Street, where he inquired after Mr. Reynolds. The landlady, impressed by Ethan's appearance and polite manner, directed him to a nearby cafe where the secretary took his breakfast each morning. Reynolds proved to be a thin, precise man in his 50s, with ink-stained fingers and the perpetually worried expression of someone who carries many responsibilities but little authority. When Ethan approached his table, introducing himself as a cattle rancher looking to diversify his investments, Reynolds was initially suspicious but soon warmed to the conversation. Mining can be quite profitable, Mr. Aldridge, he acknowledged, stirring his coffee meticulously, though not without significant risk. I understand Blackmore Enterprises has been particularly successful, Ethan prompted. I was sorry to hear of Mr. Blackmore's passing. Tragic circumstances. Reynolds's expression tightened. Indeed, a great loss to the business community. I understand his partner has taken control of operations. Ethan kept his tone casual, merely interested. Mr. Harmon has assumed full management, yes. Reynolds lowered his voice. Though between us, sir, the transition has not been entirely smooth. Ethan leaned forward slightly. Oh. The secretary glanced around before continuing. There are discrepancies in the books that Mr. Blackmore was investigating before his untimely death. Nothing I can specify, you understand, but concerning nonetheless. I imagine such discrepancies might cause tension between partners, Ethan suggested. Reynolds's eyes narrowed slightly. Your interest seems rather specific, Mr. Aldridge, for someone merely considering investments. Ethan backtracked smoothly, simply due diligence. I prefer to understand any business thoroughly before committing funds. Speaking of which, I've heard the Silverleaf mine is the primary asset. The secretary relaxed somewhat, returning to familiar territory. Yes, it's been exceptionally productive. The last quarterly report showed record output. Impressive, Ethan nodded. I'd be interested in seeing the operation if possible. Mr. Harmon occasionally conducts tour for potential investors, Reynolds acknowledged. He's currently in Bozeman but expected back tomorrow. I could mention your interest when he returns. Ethan managed to conceal his reaction to this news. If Harmon was returning tomorrow, their window of opportunity was narrowing rapidly. That would be most appreciated, he said, rising from the table. I'm staying at the Grand Hotel. Please have Mr. Harmon contact me there if he's willing to discuss potential investment. He had no intention of returning to the hotel, of course, but the misdirection might buy them time. His next stop was the laundry near the railway station, a steamy establishment filled with the scent of soap and the sound of women working. He approached the counter with a shirt that had been deliberately soiled, explaining he needed it cleaned quickly for an important meeting. Mrs. Fletcher's sister, a plump, rosy-cheeked woman with sharp eyes, assessed both the shirt and Ethan with professional interest. Rush service costs extra, she informed him briskly. But we can have it ready by tomorrow morning. Ethan agreed to the inflated price, then casually mentioned he was new to town. Just arrived from Bozeman. Terrible business there recently. Some society woman wanted for murder, I heard. The laundress's eyes lit with the universal gleam of a gossip presented with a willing audience. You mean Mrs. Blackmore, scandalous affair. Married to one of Helena's most prominent citizens, then poisoned him for his fortune, they say. You don't believe it? Ethan asked, noting her skeptical tone. She glanced around to ensure no other customers were within earshot. My sister was the Blackmore's housekeeper for 15 years, says the young Mrs. Blackmore couldn't harm a fly, let alone murder her husband. She leaned closer. Eliza, that's my sister, says there was something strange going on in that house before Mr. Blackmore died. Men coming and going at all hours, the master locking himself in his study, arguing with Mr. Harmon. Harmon, the business partner. The very same. Eliza never trusted him, said he looked at Mrs. Blackmore in a way that wasn't proper, especially with her husband right there. The laundress sniffed disapprovingly. And now he's living in the Blackmore house, bold as brass, while the poor widow is hunted like an animal. Your sister still works there. Even with Mrs. Blackmore gone. Harmon kept her on, says he needs the help while sorting through Blackmore's affairs. But Eliza says he's searching for something, tearing apart the study, going through every drawer and cabinet. Ethan felt a surge of excitement. Searching for what? The laundress shrugged. Eliza doesn't know, but she says he gets more desperate by the day. She handed Ethan a receipt for his shirt. Tomorrow morning, sir. Not a minute before. Ethan returned to the livery stable with his information, finding Tessa pacing their small room anxiously. Harmon's in Bozeman but returning tomorrow, he reported immediately. We need to move quickly. Did you learn anything useful? She asked, gesturing for him to sit as she poured water from a pitcher into a basin for him to wash. Ethan described his conversations with Reynolds and the laundress as he rinsed trail dust from his face and hands. The discrepancies Reynolds mentioned, Tessa said thoughtfully, that matches what I overheard between Charles and Harmon. Something about the ore shipments not aligning with the reported output. And now Harmon's searching the house, Ethan added, looking for something specific. Charles's private records, Tessa realized, eyes widening. He kept a separate set of books, a personal record of all transactions. He never trusted banks or lawyers with certain information. Where did he keep these records? In his study, I presumed, but if Harmon hasn't found them. Ethan dried his hands on a rough towel. Is there a safe, a hidden compartment? Tessa paced the small room thinking, not that I know of, but Charles was methodical, cautious. She stopped suddenly. The library. There's a false panel in the bookcase. Charles showed it to me once, said it was built by the previous owner for hiding valuables during territorial disputes. Would Harmon know about it? I don't think so. Charles said it was a family secret passed down when he purchased the house. Excitement colored her voice. If the records are there, they might show what Harmon was doing, perhaps evidence he was embezzling from the company or manipulating the ore shipments. Enough motive for murder, Ethan agreed. But how do we get into the house? You said yourself it would be watched. Tessa's expression turned determined. Through the servant's entrance. Mrs. Fletcher has a spare key. She'd give it to me if she knew I was trying to clear my name. Too risky. If she's seen speaking with you. Then you'll have to get the key, Tessa decided. When you collect your shirt tomorrow, ask to speak with Mrs. Fletcher's sister privately. Explain enough that she'll help, but not so much that she's endangered. Ethan considered the plan. It was dangerous. If caught breaking into the Blackmore mansion, he'd face serious charges, possibly even be implicated in Charles's murder. But if they succeeded in finding evidence against Harmon. We'll go tomorrow night, he said finally. After dark, when the house is quiet, you'll guide me to the library and we'll find these records together. Tessa moved to sit beside him on the narrow bed, her shoulder brushing his. You're risking everything for me, she said softly. Your freedom, your ranch, your life. Ethan turned to face her, struck again by her transformation. The shorter hair emphasized her delicate features, made her look younger, more vulnerable. Yet there was steel in her green eyes, the quiet courage that had carried her through these past terrible weeks. Some things are worth the risk, he said simply. Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a recognition. She leaned forward hesitantly, giving him time to pull away if he wished. He didn't. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepening with a hunger that surprised them both. Ethan's hands found her waist, drawing her closer as her arms wound around his neck. For a moment, the danger awaiting them tomorrow vanished, replaced by the simple, overwhelming joy of connection. When they finally parted, both breathless, Tessa rested her forehead against his. I never expected this, she whispered. You. Nor I you, Ethan admitted, tucking a strand of her shortened hair behind her ear. But now I can't imagine any other path. They spent the night in the narrow bed, holding each other close, speaking in whispers of possibilities neither had dared consider before. A life together far from Helena and its painful memories, perhaps even at the Circle A if Tessa's name could be cleared. Do you think it's possible, she asked as dawn approached. To prove Harmon's guilt. Ethan tightened his arm around her. Yes, and if we can't find the evidence in your husband's records, we'll find another way, I promise you that. Morning arrived all too soon. Ethan left to collect his shirt, and more importantly, to speak with Mrs. Fletcher's sister. Tessa remained in their room, preparing for the night's dangerous undertaking by drawing a detailed floor plan of the Blackmore mansion from memory. When Ethan returned, his expression was grim. "What's wrong?" Tessa asked immediately, setting aside her sketches. "Harmon returned early. He's already back in Helena." Ethan placed a small brass key on the table between them. "And there's something else." The laundress says her sister overheard Harmon instructing his men to search every boarding house and hotel in the city. "He knows we're here." Tessa's hand flew to her mouth. "How?" "Someone must have recognized me yesterday, or at least reported a stranger asking questions about Blackmore Enterprises." Ethan ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "We can't wait until tonight. As soon as it's dark, we need to move." "The house will be occupied," Tessa protested. "Harmon might be there and servants and—" "It's a risk we have to take," Ethan cut her off gently. "If we wait, we might lose our chance entirely." Twilight found them slipping through the back alleys of Helena, keeping to shadows as they made their way toward the affluent north side. Tessa had changed into her plainest dress, while Ethan wore dark clothing that wouldn't catch the light. Both were acutely aware that their freedom, possibly their lives, depended on remaining undetected. The Blackmore mansion rose imposingly against the darkening sky, its windows illuminated with the warm glow of lamps. From their vantage point in the gardens behind the neighboring property, they could see figures moving within, servants going about evening duties. "There's a servant's door on the east side," Tessa whispered, pointing. "It leads to the kitchen, then a back staircase up to the main floor. The library is at the front of the house." Ethan nodded, surveying the grounds for any sign of guards. "Stay close behind me. If anything happens, if we're separated, make for Jacob's livery. He'll help you." They crept through the carefully maintained gardens, keeping low among ornamental shrubs until they reached the servants' entrance. The small brass key turned smoothly in the lock, allowing them access to a warm kitchen that smelled of bread and roasting meat. It was empty, the staff likely serving dinner in the formal dining room. They moved quickly through the kitchen to the narrow staircase Tessa had described, ascending to the main floor with silent steps. The opulence of the Blackmore home struck Ethan immediately, gleaming hardwood floors, expensive artwork, furnishings that spoke of old money and refined taste. It was a world away from his rustic ranch house, a stark reminder of the different lives he and Tessa had led before fate thrust them together. Tessa led the way down a dimly lit hallway, pausing at corners to listen for approaching footsteps. The library door stood partially open, lamplight spilling into the corridor. She froze, placing a warning hand on Ethan's arm. Voices drifted from within, male voices engaged in conversation. "Still missing, obviously in hiding," came a voice Ethan recognized as Victor Harmon's. "But my men will find her. She can't have gone far without resources." "And if they do find her?" asked a second man. "The evidence is circumstantial at best. A good lawyer might." "She won't live to see a courtroom," Harmon interrupted coldly. "A tragic accident while resisting arrest." "Much cleaner that way." Tessa's fingers dug into Ethan's arm, her face pale in the dim light. He pulled her back, away from the door, his mind racing. They couldn't access the library with Harmon present, but they couldn't afford to wait. He leaned close to her ear. "Is there another entrance, a connecting room?" She shook her head, then paused, thinking. Charles's study connects to the library through a shared fireplace. "There's a door hidden in the paneling, designed when the house was built so the master could move between rooms without being observed." "Can we reach the study without passing the library?" "Yes, through the music room." "But Ethan," her voice dropped even lower, "the study is where Harmon has been searching. It might not be safe." "It was their only option." Carefully they retreated down the hallway, following Tessa's directions to a smaller room dominated by a grand piano. French doors led to an adjoining space, Charles Blackmore's private study. Unlike the rest of the house, the study showed signs of recent disturbance. Drawers hung open, papers were scattered across the massive desk, and books had been pulled from shelves and discarded carelessly on the floor. "Harmon's been thorough," Ethan whispered, surveying the chaos. Tessa moved directly to the fireplace, an elaborate marble affair with ornate carvings. "The passage is here," she murmured, running her fingers along the wood paneling beside the mantel. "If I can just remember how to." A faint click and a section of paneling swung inward, revealing a narrow passage between the walls. "Stay here," Ethan instructed. I'll go through, check if the library is clear. No, Tessa shook her head firmly. I know what we're looking for, we go together. The passage was tight, forcing them to move sideways, shoulders brushing the walls. It ended at another panel, this one allowing them to peer through a small gap into the library before opening it fully. The room was now empty, Harmon and his companion apparently having concluded their conversation. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes arranged by subject. Where's this hidden compartment? Ethan asked, scanning the room. Tessa moved to a section of shelving near the window, running her fingers along the edge of a shelf at eye level. Charles showed me once. It's triggered by pulling this specific book. Her fingers closed around a volume of Shakespeare, pulling it partially out of alignment with its neighbors. A soft click sounded, and a section of the bookcase swung outward slightly. Inside the hidden compartment was a metal box, small but heavy, locked with a simple key mechanism. The key, Tessa whispered urgently. Charles kept it on his watch chain. Ethan examined the lock. I might be able to pick it, but not here, too risky. He took the box, testing its weight. We need to get out now. They had just closed the hidden compartment when footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. Without hesitation, Ethan pulled Tessa back toward the secret passage, closing the panel behind them just as the library door opened. Through the thin wall, they could hear Harmon's voice again. Check once more. Those records must be somewhere in this house. Heart-pounding, Ethan guided Tessa back through the passage to the study. They emerged carefully, listening for any sign that Harmon's search had extended to this room. Silence greeted them. Moving swiftly but quietly, they retraced their steps through the music room, down the back staircase, and finally out the servants' entrance into the cool night air. They didn't speak until they had put several blocks between themselves and the Blackmore mansion, ducking into an alleyway to catch their breath. We need to get this open, Ethan said, examining the metal box in the dim light. Any ideas where we might find tools? Tessa thought for a moment. Jacob's livery. He must have tools for shoeing horses. The livery was dark when they arrived, Jacob having retired to his quarters above the main office. Rather than disturb him, they slipped into the workshop area where, as Tessa had predicted, they found an assortment of tools. Using a thin file and considerable patience, Ethan managed to manipulate the lock mechanism until it gave way with a satisfying click. Inside the box were several leather-bound ledgers, a packet of letters tied with string, and a sealed envelope with Charles Blackmore's name written across the front in an official hand. Tessa opened the first ledger, her fingers tracing the neat columns of figures recorded in her husband's precise handwriting. These are the private records Charles kept, she confirmed. Records of every shipment from the Silverleaf mine, with dates, quantities, and values. Ethan leaned over her shoulder, examining the notations. What are these marks, the circled entries? I'm not sure, Tessa frowned, flipping through the pages. But look at these shipments from last autumn. The official company records showed 20 tons of silver ore shipped to the Helena smelter, but Charles's private records show 30 tons extracted from the mine. 10 tons unaccounted for, Ethan said slowly. Where did it go? Tessa continued through the ledger, finding more discrepancies, shipments recorded in the private books that never appeared in the official company records. Charles was documenting theft, she realized. Systematic theft of ore before it reached the company smelter. Harmon, Ethan guessed, diverting shipments for his own profit. It would be worth thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of dollars, Tessa agreed. And Charles was collecting evidence. She turned to the packet of letters, untying the string with trembling fingers. Most were business correspondence, but several were from a private investigator Charles had hired to track the missing shipments. The final letter, dated just 3 days before Charles's death, confirmed what they had suspected. The investigator had traced the diverted ore to a small, independent smelter across the territorial border, owned through a series of shell companies that all led back to Victor Harmon. Here's your motive, Ethan said grimly. Blackmore discovered his partner was stealing from their company. He was gathering evidence, probably planning to confront Harmon legally. So Harmon killed him, Tessa whispered, before Charles could expose him. The sealed envelope remained. Tessa broke the wax seal, withdrawing several official-looking documents. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. It's an affidavit, she said, voice thick with emotion. Charles filed it with the territorial judge 3 days before he died. He was formally accusing Harmon of embezzlement and fraud, requesting a full investigation of the company's finances. Does it mention the poison? The arsenic found in your belongings. Tessa shook her head, but these records, combined with the affidavit, it's evidence of motive. It might be enough to cast reasonable doubt on my guilt, perhaps even redirect suspicion toward Harmon. Ethan carefully returned the documents to the box. We need to get these to the territorial marshal. He has authority above the local sheriff, who might be influenced by Harmon's position in Helena. The marshal's office is on the other side of town, Tessa said, gathering the box to her chest. If we leave now. The stable door crashed open, silhouetting a large figure against the dim light from the street. Found them, Mr. Harmon, a rough voice called. In the livery, just like you said. Ethan's hand flew to his revolver, drawing it as two more men pushed through the doorway. In the shadows behind them, Victor Harmon's cultured voice rang out. Careful, gentlemen, Mr. Aldridge is armed, and Mrs. Blackmore appears to be holding something of great value to me. Run, Ethan hissed to Tessa, placing himself between her and the intruders. Through the back door, get to the marshal. But more figures appeared at the rear entrance. Harmon had surrounded the building. They were trapped. Please, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, Harmon said, stepping into the stable. In the dim light, his handsome features were set in an expression of determined patience, as if dealing with recalcitrant children. Mrs. Blackmore, I'll take that box now. So you can destroy the evidence that you murdered my husband. Tessa's voice was stronger than Ethan had expected, ringing with accusation. We know what you did, Victor. We have proof. Harmon's smile was cold. What you have is speculation and circumstantial evidence, hardly enough to counter the very real arsenic found in your possession, my dear. He gestured to his men. Take the box. Kill Aldridge if he resists. Wait, Tessa said quickly, holding up one hand while clutching the box with the other. These records are only copies, Victor. The originals are already on their way to the territorial marshal, along with a full account of your crimes. It was a desperate bluff, but Ethan admired her quick thinking. Uncertainty flashed across Harmon's face before he mastered it. You're lying, he said flatly. You haven't left this stable since returning from my house. Your house, Tessa's voice dripped contempt. You mean my husband's house, which you're occupying while plotting to frame me for his murder. Harmon's composure slipped further. You have no proof I was involved in Charles's death. Don't we? Ethan kept his revolver steady, watching the men surrounding them. The discrepancies in the ore shipments, the private smelter you own across the border, the affidavit Charles filed with the judge 3 days before he died, accusing you specifically of embezzlement and fraud. Genuine alarm registered on Harmon's face. Affidavit? What affidavits? Tessa seized on his reaction. Charles knew what you were doing. He documented everything, prepared legal action against you. That's why you killed him, to prevent him from exposing your theft. And then you planted arsenic in Mrs. Blackmore's belongings, Ethan added, creating the perfect scapegoat while you took control of the company and continued your scheme. Harmon's face had gone pale, his confident manner evaporating. You can't prove any of this. The territorial marshal will be the judge of that, Ethan replied. And I imagine he'll be very interested in questioning the independent smelter operators about who was really behind their operation. One of Harmon's men shifted uneasily. Mr. Harmon, what do you want us to do? For a moment indecision warred on Harmon's face, then his expression hardened. Take the box, kill them both, make it look like they resisted arrest. He turned toward the door. I'll establish my alibi at the Helena Club. You're just going to leave, the man sounded uncertain. Might be better if we don't. I don't pay you to think, Harmon snapped. Just handle it and make sure those documents never reach the marshal. As Harmon stepped outside, Ethan caught Tessa's eye, a silent message passing between them. They were outnumbered, outgunned, but not yet defeated. Hear that, boys? Ethan called to the hired men. Your employer just left you to commit double murder while he establishes an alibi. If you're caught, he'll deny any knowledge of your actions. The men exchanged uneasy glances. And you will be caught, Tessa added with surprising authority. The evidence in this box implicates Harmon in major financial crimes. Do you really want to add murder charges when he's arrested? He ain't been arrested yet, one man growled, though with less conviction than before. But he will be, came a new voice from the stable entrance. Jacob Miller stood there, shotgun in hand, with 3 other men similarly armed. And so will you boys if you don't drop those weapons right now. Relief flooded through Ethan. His friend must have heard the commotion from his quarters and summoned help. Harmon's men, finding themselves suddenly outnumbered, lowered their weapons reluctantly. Jacob, Ethan said with heartfelt gratitude, we need to get to the marshal's office immediately. And someone needs to stop Victor Harmon before he leaves town. Within the hour, they were seated in Territorial Marshal James Callahan's office, the metal box and its contents spread across his desk. The grizzled lawman had been roused from his bed, but was fully alert as he examined the evidence. This is mighty serious business, he said finally, looking up at Ethan and Tessa. Financial fraud, embezzlement, and now murder accusations against one of Helena's most prominent citizens. I understand how it appears, Marshal, Tessa said earnestly. But my husband's records show clear evidence of Harmon's crimes. The affidavit proves Charles was preparing legal action against him. And the arsenic found in Mrs. Blackmore's belongings, Callahan asked. Planted, Ethan stated firmly, to frame her while Harmon took control of the company and continued his scheme. The marshal rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. It's circumstantial but compelling. Enough to reopen the investigation into Charles Blackmore's death, certainly. He gathered the documents carefully. Mrs. Blackmore, I'm afraid I'll need to place you in protective custody while we sort this out. Protective custody, Ethan echoed sharply. She's the victim here, not a criminal. And she'll be treated accordingly, Callahan assured him. But there's a warrant for her arrest that I can't simply ignore. The best I can do is keep her safe and comfortable while we investigate these new allegations. Tessa placed a calming hand on Ethan's arm. It's all right, she said softly. If it means clearing my name, I'll gladly cooperate. Callahan's deputies had already apprehended Harmon at the Helena Club, bringing him to a separate holding cell within the marshal's office. Through the closed door, they could hear his vehement protests and demands for a lawyer. What happens now? Ethan asked as a female deputy prepared to escort Tessa to her temporary quarters. Now we investigate, Callahan replied. Thoroughly, I'll send deputies to that independent smelter, question the operators about their relationship with Harmon. If your accusations are accurate, someone will talk. He looked at Tessa with newfound respect. Your husband kept meticulous records, ma'am. That may prove to be Harmon's undoing. Before Tessa was led away, Ethan caught her hand. I'll be right here, he promised, however long it takes. Her smile was tinged with sadness. You should return to your ranch. You've risked enough for me already. The ranch can wait, he said firmly. This can't. The investigation proceeded more swiftly than either had dared hope. With the territorial marshal personally involved, resources were dedicated to uncovering the truth behind Charles Blackmore's death and the financial crimes that preceded it. The operators of the independent smelter, faced with charges of conspiracy and fraud, quickly implicated Harmon as the mastermind behind the diverted ore shipments. Bank records confirmed substantial payments to Harmon's private accounts corresponding to the missing shipments detailed in Charles's records. Most damning of all, the marshal's men discovered arsenic in Harmon's quarters at the Blackmore mansion, the same type found in Tessa's belongings and in Charles's body. A servant recalled seeing Harmon in Tessa's dressing room shortly before the sheriff's search that had discovered the poison. After a week of intense investigation, Marshal Callahan summoned Ethan to his office. Tessa was already there, seated beside the marshal's desk, her face alight with an emotion Ethan couldn't immediately identify. Mr. Aldridge, Callahan greeted him warmly. I've just informed Mrs. Blackmore that all charges against her have been dropped. Victor Harmon has been formally charged with the murder of Charles Blackmore, as well as embezzlement, fraud, and attempted murder of both of you. Relief washed over Ethan like a physical wave. It's over, he asked, hardly daring to believe it. The legal proceedings against Harmon will continue for some time, Callahan cautioned. Mrs. Blackmore may need to testify, but yes, her ordeal is over. She's free to go. Tessa rose from her chair, crossing to Ethan with tears shimmering in her eyes. I'm free, she whispered. Because of you. Ethan shook his head, because of your husband's foresight and your courage. Marshal Callahan cleared his throat. There is the matter of Mrs. Blackmore's estate. As Charles Blackmore's lawful widow and heir, now cleared of any involvement in his death, she stands to inherit his entire fortune, the the house, the business interests, everything. The implications weren't lost on Ethan. Tessa was now one of the wealthiest women in Montana territory, with a position in Helena society that would be quickly restored once the truth of Harmon's crimes became widely known. And he was a cattle rancher with a modest spread 10 miles south of Bozeman. Their worlds, briefly and intensely intertwined by circumstance, were about to diverge again, perhaps permanently. "You'll need time to settle your affairs," he said carefully, stepping back from her. "I should return to the Circle A. The spring cattle drive will need preparation." Confusion then hurt flashed across Tessa's face. "You're leaving now." "Mrs. Blackmore will have many matters requiring her attention," Marshal Callahan observed, sensing the tension between them. "Perhaps you could continue this conversation privately. My office is at your disposal for the next hour." He withdrew tactfully, closing the door behind him. In the sudden silence, Ethan found himself unable to meet Tessa's gaze. "So that's it?" she asked quietly. "You saved my life, helped clear my name, and then simply leave." "You have your life back," Ethan replied, still not looking at her. "Your home, your husband's business, your position in society. And you think that's what I want?" There was a new edge to her voice, anger mingled with disbelief. "After everything we've been through together." Finally, he raised his eyes to hers. "What I think doesn't matter. The reality is that you're a wealthy widow with prospects and responsibilities here in Helena. I'm a rancher with land that demands my constant attention and offers little comfort." "I see," Tessa's expression cooled. "You've made your decision based on what you believe I want or need, without bothering to ask me." "Tessa." "No," she cut him off sharply. "You don't get to decide my future for me, Ethan Aldridge, not after everything we've survived together." Her voice softened slightly. "I thought you knew me better than that." He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "What do you want me to say? That I've fallen in love with you, that I've imagined a future together every night since I found you in that blizzard, that I'm terrified you'll choose comfort and civilization over a hard life with me?" The words burst from him without planning or filter, leaving him exposed in a way he'd never allowed himself to be. Tessa's expression transformed, warmth replacing the hurt and anger. "Yes," she said simply, "that's exactly what I want you to say, because I've fallen in love with you too, Ethan." She stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "I don't want the mansion or the business or Helena society. I never did. Those were Charles's world, not mine." Her green eyes held his steadily. "What I want is a life with meaning, with purpose, with someone who sees me as I truly am and loves me anyway. Someone who would risk everything to save me from a storm and then from false accusations, and never once ask for anything in return." "The ranch is a hard life," he warned, though hope was rising in his chest like the sun after a long, dark night. "Harder than fleeing across Montana territory in winter, harder than being accused of murder," she smiled. "I think I can manage ranch life, Mr. Aldridge, especially with the right partner." "You'd give up everything, your inheritance, your position, to live at the Circle A." "Not give up," she corrected gently. "Transform. The Blackmore fortune can do a lot of good, expanding your ranch, helping neighboring families, building schools and medical clinics for the territory." Her smile widened. "And I'd be gaining far more than I'd be leaving behind." Ethan pulled her into his arms, overcome with a joy he'd never expected to feel. "I love you, Tessa Keller Blackmore. More than I knew was possible." "And I love you," she whispered against his lips. "My rescuer, my partner, my future." Their kiss sealed a promise that had begun in a snowstorm and solidified through danger and courage. A bond forged in the harshest conditions the frontier could offer, and all the stronger for it. 2 months later, with spring painting the Montana landscape in vivid greens and wildflowers, Ethan Aldridge and Tessa Blackmore were married in a simple ceremony at the Circle A Ranch. The entire county attended, drawn by the now famous story of their meeting during the blizzard and the subsequent clearing of Tessa's name. The newlyweds stood on the porch of the ranch house after the guests had departed, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and purple. "Having regrets?" Ethan asked, only half joking as he wrapped an arm around his wife's waist. "Missing your mansion in Helena?" Tessa leaned into his embrace, her shortened hair now grown into a becoming style that suited her new life. "Not for a moment," she assured him. "Everything I need is right here." Inside the house, Mrs. Hoffman was preparing their wedding dinner, humming contentedly as she worked. The housekeeper had been delighted with the marriage, declaring that the master needed a woman's touch around the place and not just 3 days a week. "I've been thinking," Tessa said, turning in Ethan's arms to face him, "about what to do with the Silverleaf mine and Charles's other business interests." And he brushed a tendril of hair from her face, still sometimes struck by disbelief that this remarkable woman had chosen him, chosen this life. "I want to establish a trust. The profits will fund schools throughout the territory, particularly for ranchers and miners' children who can't easily reach town." Her eyes shone with purpose. "Education was my passion before I married Charles. I'd like to make it my mission now." "Mrs. Tessa Aldridge, frontier educator," Ethan smiled. "I like the sound of that. And mother," she added softly, placing his hand against her still flat stomach. "In about 7 months, if the doctor in Bozeman is correct." Ethan stared at her, momentarily speechless with wonder and joy. "A baby, we're going to have a baby." Tessa nodded, her smile radiant. "A child of the frontier, born to parents who found each other in a blizzard and fought through fire to be together." Ethan lifted her off her feet in an exuberant embrace, spinning her in a circle that made her laugh with delight. When he set her down again, his expression had grown serious. "I promise you this, Tessa Aldridge, our child will grow up knowing love and security, no matter how harsh the frontier becomes. I will never allow this family to face the world alone, the way I thought I had to." "I know," she said, touching his face tenderly. "That's why I fell in love with you. The man who rescued me from the storm, not knowing I would rescue his heart in return." As they stood together in the gathering dusk, the Circle A spread out before them like a kingdom they would build together. Ethan reflected on how thoroughly his life had changed since that snowstorm months ago. He had ridden out alone that day, believing in his father's harsh lesson that a man stands alone against the elements. He had been wrong. The greatest strength came not from isolation but from the bonds forged with others, from love freely given and received, from the family he and Tessa would create together. The frontier would always be harsh, demanding resilience and courage from those who called it home. But Ethan now understood what his father had learned too late. Facing those challenges with the right partner made all the difference. As night fell over the Montana territory, stars emerging like diamonds scattered across black velvet, Ethan led his wife into their home, into the future they would build together, one day, one season, 1 year at a time. The storm that had brought them together had long passed, but the love it had awakened would endure through all the seasons of their lives.